It was said that Gideon Cross could choose any woman in the valley, and he knew it. Wealthy widows, high-born ladies, the most ambitious women in the frontier had all tried. None succeeded. But then one autumn morning, a worn-out hat was placed at his door, sewn by the hands of a girl nobody in town would even look at, and everything changed completely. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because this is just the beginning. The morning Gideon Cross rode back into Caldwell Flats, after 3 days of chasing strays along the northern ridgeline, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly, and had spent the better part of 2 nights in weather that couldn't decide between rain and ice. His duster was caked with dried mud along the hem. His boots had a split forming on the left sole that he kept meaning to get fixed and kept forgetting about. The gray in his stubble had gotten more pronounced in the past year, though he'd have argued with anyone who pointed it out. He came into town the back way, cutting behind the feed store and the livery, not because he was hiding — Gideon Cross didn't hide from anyone — but because the main street of Caldwell Flats on a Thursday morning meant running a gauntlet he wasn't in the mood for. The women. Not all women, specific women. The kind who watched him ride past their windows and started composing sentences in their heads before he'd even cleared their front steps. He'd been back in the valley 18 months now, since his father's death. Long enough for people to take stock of what Gideon Cross had become. Sole owner of the Cross Ranch, nearly 4,000 acres of good grazing land, a herd that had survived 2 hard winters without significant loss, and a reputation that had been built slowly and without the kind of shortcuts that tended to collapse on people later. He was 38 years old, unmarried, and, as the widows and their allies in the social circles of Caldwell Flats had calculated with considerable precision, not likely to stay that way forever. The problem, from their perspective, was that Gideon didn't seem to understand his own situation. He rode past the back of Harriet Vance's house and caught a glimpse of movement at the upstairs window. He kept his eyes straight ahead. Harriet was 42, sharp as a tack, and had been sending him pies since October. The pies were excellent. He ate them. He did not interpret them as anything other than pies, which drove Harriet's daughter Agnes to absolute distraction. He tied his horse at the rail outside the general store and went inside for coffee beans and a box of cartridges. Martin Ferris, who ran the store and had an opinion about everything, leaned on the counter with his elbows and watched Gideon move through the aisles. "You hear about the Caldwell dance next Saturday?" Martin said. "Heard something about it. Eleanor Graves is organizing it. She specifically mentioned—" "Martin," Gideon said, without turning around, "I need coffee and ammunition. I don't need news." Martin closed his mouth. He'd known Gideon Cross since the man was 12 years old, and he knew that tone. Gideon paid for his goods, tied them to his saddlebag, and was almost back on his horse when he heard someone say his name from across the street. Ruth Alderman, 60 years old, and the unofficial historian of every piece of gossip in a 30-mile radius, standing outside the dressmaker's shop with her hands folded and her eyes doing that particular thing they did when she was about to deliver information she considered important. "Gideon Cross," she said, "I have something for you." He almost kept riding. He genuinely considered it. But Ruth Alderman had known his mother, and that created a category of obligation that he couldn't quite talk himself out of. So he dismounted again and crossed the street. "What is it, Mrs. Alderman?" She held out a paper-wrapped bundle, the size of a hat box but softer, folded rather than boxed. "This was left at my door this morning with your name on it. I didn't open it," she added, which meant she had tried to open it and failed, or the shape had made it obvious what was inside. He took it. It was lighter than he expected. He unwrapped it right there on the street, because Ruth was watching him with the focused attention of a woman who would remember every detail of this moment for the next 20 years. He went still. It was his father's hat. Not what was left of his father's hat, the hat itself, restored. The crown had been reshaped. The brim had been rebuilt along the left edge, where the cattle raid had torn it down past the point of wearing, and the sweatband inside had been replaced with new leather, the same faded brown as the original. Whoever had done this had matched the color of the old felt so closely that you had to look hard to find the seam between old and repaired. The stitching was so fine it was almost invisible. Not invisible. You could see it if you looked, small and regular as the marks on a measuring tape. But it didn't call attention to itself. It was the work of someone who understood that the point wasn't to show what they'd done. The point was the hat. Gideon stood on the main street of Caldwell Flats, holding his dead father's hat, and for a moment he couldn't speak at all. "Who left it?" he finally said. His voice came out lower than he intended. Ruth's expression shifted slightly. She'd been watching for his reaction, and the reaction surprised her. "I don't know who left it at my door, but the stitching—" She paused, tilting her head. "I think it might be Eliza Rowan's work, the girl over on Birch Street. The seamstress." Gideon looked down at the hat again. Then he put it on. It fit. It fit the way it had fit on his father's head, which was close enough to his own that wearing it had always felt like reaching back through time and touching something that wasn't entirely gone. "Thank you, Mrs. Alderman," he said, and got back on his horse. He'd known about the hat's condition for 2 years. Thomas Cross had worn that hat for 31 years, through 3 cattle drives, 2 droughts, and 1 winter that had nearly bankrupted the ranch before Gideon was old enough to understand what bankruptcy meant. It had been with Thomas when he broke his leg at 44 and ran the ranch from a chair on the porch for 4 months. It had been with him when Gideon's mother died, and when he'd buried the dog that had been with them since before Gideon was born, and when Gideon himself had ridden away at 19 with a bedroll and a temper and not much else, convinced his father was wrong about everything and needing to prove it through about 15 years of hard experience. Thomas Cross had never held it against him. That was the thing Gideon had spent the most time thinking about in the years since his father died. He'd come back at 36, humbler than he'd left, and carrying the kind of knowledge that only comes from failing at things for long enough to understand what you did wrong. And his father had met him at the gate like he'd been gone a week, not 17 years, and said, "Good timing, I could use the help." The hat had been on his head then. It was damaged in the winter of the year before Thomas died. A cattle raid, rough men coming in from the Badlands with no interest in negotiation, and in the chaos of it, Thomas had taken a hit to the head that left him unconscious for 2 days, and the hat beneath the hooves of a panicked animal. Gideon had found it afterward in the mud, the left brim torn and crushed in a way that didn't repair easily. His father had looked at it when he recovered, turned it in his hands, and set it on the windowsill of the bedroom without saying anything. He'd never worn it again. He died 7 months later, not from the head injury directly, but it hadn't helped. The hat sat on the windowsill until Gideon packed up the room, and then it sat in a box in the back of the closet because he couldn't throw it away and couldn't figure out what else to do with it. He'd shown it to 2 cobblers and a saddle maker, all of whom told him the brim damage was too extensive to fix without it looking patched. He'd accepted that and tried to stop thinking about it. Someone hadn't accepted that. Birch Street was the ragged eastern end of Caldwell Flats, the part of town that the more prosperous residents tended to discuss in terms of what it used to be or what it might become, rather than what it currently was. The buildings there were older and less maintained, the kind of structures that had been put up fast during the first rush of settlement and never quite caught up to being permanent. Some of them had been converted into residences, some into small enterprises that didn't require much foot traffic. The seamstress's place was a narrow building between a closed-up barber shop and a house with a collapsed porch. There was a sign in the window, hand-lettered, modest, listing alterations and repairs, and through the glass Gideon could see bolts of fabric stacked on shelves and a workbench positioned near the window for the light. He knocked. There was a pause, the sound of something being set down, and then the door opened. He'd seen Eliza Rowan before. Caldwell Flats wasn't large enough for people to be truly invisible, and he had a habit of noticing things. She was maybe 24 or 25, slight, with dark hair pulled back in a practical way that wasn't particularly concerned with how it looked. She had a small scar on her chin, old enough to be faded, and the kind of hands that showed their work. There were needle pricks along the index finger of her right hand, and a faint ink stain near her wrist. She was looking at him with an expression that was very carefully composed, like someone who had expected this visit and was not sure it was welcome. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Mr. Cross." A beat. "Mrs. Alderman told you." "She suggested it might be your work." Eliza nodded once, like that was reasonable. She didn't say anything else, which made him realize most people would have started explaining or apologizing by now, and she wasn't doing either. "Can I come in?" he asked. She stepped back from the door. The inside of the shop was small and densely organized. Every surface had a purpose. Fabric here, thread there, a cabinet along the wall with small labeled drawers that he suspected held fasteners and hooks, and the 100 other small things that went into the work. It smelled like new cloth, and something with a slight lanolin quality, probably the leather treatment she'd used on the hatband. A dress form stood in the corner wearing a half-finished skirt that was clearly someone's work order. The sewing machine near the window was old but well-maintained. She'd been eating lunch at the workbench, a piece of bread and some cheese on a cloth napkin, and she didn't try to hide it or move it. She just stood near the bench and waited. "Mrs. Alderman didn't tell me why," Gideon said, "or how you came to have it." Eliza folded her arms, not defensively, more like she was settling into the conversation. "I found the hat in the box outside Ferris's store about 3 months ago. There were a few other things with it. Some tools, a coat with moth damage. I don't think anyone left them there intentionally. I think they fell off a wagon." He remembered that. He'd been moving things from the storage room to the barn and lost a box off the back of the flatbed on Main Street. He'd noticed when he got home and gone back to look for it, but someone had already cleared the spill. He'd assumed the goods were gone. "You kept it." "I kept the hat," she said. "The rest went back to whoever could use it. I meant to return the hat to you right away, but I could see what it was. What it had been, I mean, and I thought—" She stopped, which was the first moment she looked uncertain. "I shouldn't have done it without asking. I know that, but I had the materials and I thought I could fix it, so I did." "Without asking," Gideon said. "Without asking." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, like she was waiting to find out if she'd overstepped, but without the flinching quality of someone expecting punishment. "How long did it take you?" Something in her expression relaxed very slightly. 3 weeks, off and on. The brim wire was the hardest part. I had to source a gauge that matched the original. The felt I dyed myself. I matched it to a piece of the original under the crown, where the color hadn't faded. He hadn't noticed that. He took the hat off and looked at the underside of the brim. She was right. The older felt was slightly richer in tone, and the new section matched it almost exactly, drawing from the protected interior rather than the sun-bleached exterior. "That's good work," he said. "Thank you." He put the hat back on. "What do I owe you?" Eliza shook her head. "Nothing." "For 3 weeks of work and sourcing materials?" "Nothing," she said again, and her tone was firm without being dramatic about it. "I did it because I wanted to. I don't need payment for something I wanted to do." Gideon Cross had been negotiating prices with ranchers, suppliers, and trail bosses for 20 years, and he recognized when someone had made a final decision on something. He let it go. "Then I'll say thank you," he said. "My father would have—" He stopped. He wore that hat every day for 30 years. It meant something to him. "I know," she said quietly. The wear patterns were specific. Someone who works that much, you can read it in what they carry. He looked at her again differently this time. She was looking at the hat rather than at him, and her expression was the careful, attentive look of someone who thought in details. The kind of look his father used to have when he was reading weather or reading cattle. Not dramatic, just present and exact. "Thank you, Miss Rowan," he said. "You're welcome, Mr. Cross." He left. Walking back down Birch Street to where he'd tied his horse, he turned the visit over in his head and couldn't find anything in it that resembled the calculations he'd grown accustomed to encountering. No angle, no message. 3 weeks of skilled work left at someone's door, and she didn't want a thing for it. He rode home thinking about that. The Cross Ranch sat at the north end of the valley where the land started to rise toward the ridge, and it had the look of a place that had been worked hard and built up slowly rather than thrown together. The main house was solid, 2 stories, with a covered porch that wrapped around the east and south sides. The barn was the largest structure, built to hold a serious herd through a serious winter. There were 4 outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the hands, and a smokehouse that his father had put up the year Gideon left, and that Gideon had been using ever since without ever quite acknowledging, even to himself, that it was excellent work. He had 3 full-time hands: Walt, who was 50-something and had been with the ranch since before Gideon was born; Cobb, who was 26 and the best roper in the county when he wasn't showing off about it, and a man named Sayers who did not talk much but was reliable in weather and reliable with cattle, which was what mattered. In spring and fall he hired extra help, but right now it was the three of them running the daily work. Walt was patching a fence section near the main gate when Gideon rode in, and he looked up and saw the hat, and his whole face changed. "That's Thomas's hat," he said. "It is." Walt set down his tools. He'd known Thomas Cross for 30 years. He looked at the restored brim with the eye of a man who knew exactly what it had looked like before. And he said, "Who fixed it?" "Eliza Rowan, seamstress on Birch Street." Walt made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Then he said, "She did that for nothing?" "Apparently." Walt picked up his tools again and went back to the fence. After a moment he said, "Huh," which from Walt was the equivalent of a substantial speech. Gideon unsaddled his horse and turned him out, then went inside to deal with the 3 days of paperwork that had accumulated on the kitchen table. He'd grown up watching his father run a ranch with one hand and manage the books with the other, and he still wasn't entirely sure how Thomas had made it look simple, because it wasn't. There were supply orders and grazing rotation schedules and a dispute with the neighboring property about a water easement that was going to require a letter to the county land office and probably a lawyer's opinion at some point. He worked through the afternoon, and when the lights started going, he made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the valley below the ridge, spread out in the amber light like something from before the hard times came in. He was wearing the hat. He didn't take it off until he went to bed. The Cross Ranch became a topic of conversation in Caldwell Flats on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, when Gideon walked into Ferris's general store, bought his weekly supplies, and then walked across the street and had a 15-minute conversation on the front step of Eliza Rowan's shop that every person on Main Street witnessed, and approximately none of them could hear. He'd gone to return her borrowed beeswax block. She'd mentioned she used it to condition the thread on the hat band, and he'd kept it by accident, finding it in his coat pocket a week later. It was a reasonable errand. He'd thought about sending one of the hands, then decided he'd return it himself, which was not something he examined too closely. She'd come to the door in her work apron, flower on her sleeve. She apparently did her own baking on Saturdays. And they talked about the beeswax, and then about something else, and then about something else again. And by the time he realized the conversation had gone on longer than he'd intended, 3 women he recognized from the Ladies' Auxiliary of Caldwell Flats were standing in a loose cluster across the street, watching. He said goodbye to Eliza Rowan, crossed the street, tipped his hat to the Ladies' Auxiliary, and went home. By Sunday, the talk had started. There were, in Caldwell Flats, certain women who had invested considerable thought into Gideon Cross's future. Eleanor Graves, 45, widowed 3 years ago, who had a prosperous ranch of her own and believed, with some justification, that a merger of their properties would be advantageous to everyone. Meredith Holt, 38, whose late husband had left her well fixed, but whose ranch needed the kind of experienced management that her foreman wasn't providing. Louisa Whitmore, who was rich in her own right, had no interest in ranching and simply found Gideon Cross compelling enough to want in her life on whatever terms were available. These women were not stupid. They were, in fact, quite capable in their respective spheres, and Gideon didn't dislike any of them. He'd been polite to all 3, attentive when the situation called for it, and careful never to give the kind of signal that couldn't be walked back without causing damage. He'd managed this for 18 months with something like skill. What he hadn't accounted for was the hat and what the hat meant, and the fact that a poor seamstress on Birch Street had understood something about it that none of the women who'd been sending him pies and invitations had thought to consider. It was Eleanor Graves who came to see him first. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a buggy, wearing a dress that was appropriate for a working call rather than a social one, which told him she'd thought about how to play this. She was smart enough not to come in anything that looked like an attempt to impress. He offered her coffee on the porch. She accepted it and sat in the chair he'd put out. "I heard you've been calling on the Rowan girl," she said, after they'd spent 5 minutes talking about nothing in particular. "I returned something she'd lent me," he said. Eleanor looked at him steadily. She had that directness that he actually respected. She wasn't going to pretend she was there for another reason. "Gideon, people are talking." "I know." She's... Eleanor paused, and he could see her selecting words. She wasn't cruel by nature, but she was practical. She has nothing. A sewing shop on a poor street. No family connections, no property. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying that you have a ranch to run and a reputation in this valley that matters for your business. Who you associate with reflects... Eleanor, he said. She stopped. I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve that. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her steadily. I'm not looking for a business arrangement. I've been managing my own business for 20 years, and I'll keep managing it. What happened with Miss Rowan? He thought about how to say it. She found something that mattered to me, fixed it, and didn't want anything in return. That's not a small thing. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was complicated, not angry, but recalculating something. I see, she said finally. I'm sorry if I've been unclear before now, he said. That wasn't fair to you or to anyone. She set her coffee cup down and stood up, smoothing her skirt. You're a difficult man, Gideon Cross. I know that too. She left. He watched the buggy go down the lane and felt a strange combination of regret and relief, and sat on the porch for another 10 minutes before going back to work. The first act of sabotage happened 3 days later. Walt found it in the morning, a section of fence on the east boundary, clean cut rather than broken, low to the ground where it wasn't obvious from the road. 20 feet of wire, cut and removed, and 6 cattle already drifted through the gap before he caught it. He had Cobb riding the perimeter by 8 o'clock, and 2 more gaps turned up before noon. Not accident, Cobb said when he came back in. Somebody knew where to cut. Gideon rode the line himself in the afternoon, crouching at each gap and looking at the wire ends. Clean cuts, slightly different tools, more than one person or a single person being deliberate about varying the approach. The gaps were all on the east side, which bordered on the road, and on 2 properties whose owners he didn't know well. That evening, he discovered the well behind the barn had a dead quality to the water. He pulled up the bucket and smelled it. Not obviously poison, something more subtle, some material thrown in overnight to taint the taste. The cattle had been watering from the creek, so no animals were affected, but the well was going to need clearing, and it wasn't going to be quick. He told Walt and Cobb about it in the morning, standing in the barn with the doors open against the cold. This is organized, Walt said. Yes, Gideon said. About the girl? Cobb asked. He was the youngest of them and still thought in simple cause and effect terms, which sometimes made him useful. Gideon considered the question. It wasn't unreasonable. The timing was clear. Within 2 weeks of the hat, within 10 days of the talk starting around town. But he didn't think anyone would cut his fence lines over a social slight, which meant either he was wrong about the reason or there was something more happening that he didn't have the shape of yet. Maybe, he said. Keep your eyes on the perimeter. Well, he went back to see Eliza on a Thursday, this time without any errand to justify it. He just went. She was working when he arrived. Actually working, not waiting, her head bent over a piece of fabric stretched on a frame, a seam ripper in her hand, and a look of focused irritation on her face that suggested she was taking something apart that someone else had done wrong. Come in, she said, without looking up. She must have heard the knock and the door at the same time. Sorry, I need to finish this before I lose the light. He came in and sat down in the customer's chair near the door, which was harder than it looked and clearly not intended for long visits. He watched her work. She moved quickly and precisely, the seam ripper following the bad stitching with the efficiency of someone who'd done this specific thing several hundred times. You're good at that, he said. It's someone else's bad work I'm fixing, she said. It's not impressive, it's just necessary. Still good at it. She glanced up briefly, then back down. You didn't come to watch me work. I came to check in, he said. She set the seam ripper down and looked at him properly. She had a way of giving someone her full attention that felt like a decision rather than an automatic thing, like she was choosing to be present rather than just being there. Check in about what? The talk, he said. You've heard it. Mrs. Alderman came by Tuesday, Eliza said. A slight pause. She was kind about it, mostly. She wanted to warn me. Warn you of what? That I was going to get a reputation for setting my cap at you. She said it flatly, without embarrassment. That the ladies in town were not pleased. That it would be better for me if I... She stopped. She said it kindly, but the message was clear. Gideon looked at her. She was holding herself very still, and he could see the control in it. Not the stillness of someone who didn't feel anything, but someone who was deciding not to let what they felt take over. "What did you say to her?" he asked. "I said I wasn't setting my cap at anyone. I fixed a hat. That's all I did." "That's not all you did," he said. "You know that." She looked at him for a moment. "What do you mean?" He thought about how to say it without making it sound like more than it was, or less. "You did something that mattered to me. Something none of those other women would have thought of, because they were looking at what I had, not at what I was carrying." He stopped. "I'm not trying to make this more than it is. I just want you to know that I don't think of it as just a hat." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father wore it every day." "Yes." "You can tell. The sweat patterns on the band, the way the felt compressed on one side more than the other, he had a habit of pushing it to the left when he was thinking." She said it simply, like she was reporting something she'd observed, not performing sentiment. "He must have done that 10,000 times." Gideon looked at her and felt something move in his chest that wasn't exactly grief and wasn't exactly warmth and was probably some combination of the two that didn't have a name. "He did," he said. "You're right." She nodded once and picked up the seam ripper again. He stayed for another 20 minutes. They talked about the weather and about the difficulty of sourcing quality felt in the territory, and about a customer she had who kept changing her mind about buttons, and by the time he left, he felt more settled than he had in 3 days. Walking to his horse, he thought about the gaps in his fence line and the tainted well. He thought about Eleanor Graves's face when she'd left his porch. He thought about the particular calculation that said, something in this valley wants the status quo maintained, and he was becoming the kind of disruption that worried people who had things to protect. He looked up at the valley spread below him, the town sitting in it like a settlement that hadn't quite decided yet whether it was permanent. The light was going orange at the edges. He put his father's hat on his head, the brim that had been rebuilt so carefully you had to look hard to find the work, and rode home. He was in the barn at 10:30 that night when he heard Cobb's whistle from the far pasture. Too short, which meant movement he couldn't explain. Gideon took the rifle off the wall, called for Walt, and they went out together in the dark with the dogs low and quiet alongside them. They found the pasture gate open, the chain cut. 8 horses had drifted out, including the gray stallion that Gideon had spent 4 months gentling and that represented, in practical terms, the better part of $1,000. The tracks led south toward the timber. They spent 3 hours in the dark recovering them, and they got 6 back that night. The gray and a young bay mare were gone by morning. Gideon stood at the edge of the tree line in the cold dawn, his breath coming in small clouds, and felt the anger settle into something cold and specific rather than hot and shapeless. He'd been in enough hard situations to know the difference. Hot anger made you move wrong. Cold anger made you think. This was deliberate, and it was escalating, and it was not about him choosing to be decent to a seamstress. It was about something else, something with more at stake than one man's social choices. He didn't know what yet, but whatever it was leaving tracks, and tracks were something you could follow. He turned and walked back toward the house, thinking hard, watching the light come up over the ridge. The gray stallion came back on his own. Gideon found him at the edge of the south pasture on the 4th morning, standing at the fence line with a cut on his left flank that was shallow enough not to require a vet, but deep enough to have bled through the night. The bay mare didn't come back. Gideon put her down as a loss and added it to the accounting he was keeping in his head. Not a written list, nothing that could be read by the wrong person, just a running tally of what was happening and when and in what pattern. Walt helped him treat the stallion's wound that morning, the two of them working in the barn with the doors half open and the thin winter light coming in sideways. Walt held the horse steady while Gideon cleaned the cut, and neither of them said much until the work was done. "This is the 3rd thing in 10 days, Walt said. "I know." Fences, the well, and now horses. Walt ran his hand along the stallion's neck, calming him. Whoever it is, they're not trying to bankrupt you. Not yet. They're sending a message. Gideon had already arrived at the same conclusion. This wasn't the work of someone trying to destroy him outright. The sabotage was controlled, targeted, expensive enough to hurt, but not catastrophic. It was pressure. Something meant to make him reconsider a decision, or to demonstrate that someone had the reach and the will to apply it. The question was what decision they wanted him to reconsider. He went into town that afternoon, not for supplies but for information. He stopped at the land office first, a narrow building near the courthouse where a clerk named Hobbs kept the property records for the county in a state of organized chaos that only he could fully navigate. Gideon asked some general questions about the east boundary easement dispute he had with the neighboring property, and while Hobbs was pulling the relevant documents, Gideon spent some time looking at the wall map that showed the valley's property lines as they'd been recorded over the past 30 years. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He just looked. He stopped at the barber shop after that because the barber, a man named Pete Dolan, had the best intelligence network in Caldwell Flats and offered it freely to anyone patient enough to sit in the chair for 20 minutes. Gideon got a shave he didn't particularly need and listened to Pete talk about a land consolidation effort that had been rumored in the valley for the past year. Some Eastern company or a consortium of local money trying to buy up parcels on the west side of the valley where the water rights were strongest. "You hear a name attached to it?" Gideon asked. "Blackridge," Pete said. He said it the way you say a word you've heard but aren't entirely sure of the origin. Something syndicate. I don't know if it's a company or a family or what. Gideon held that name and turned it over. He'd heard it before, years ago, in a context he couldn't immediately place. Something his father had said once, in a tone Thomas Cross almost never used. A careful, flattened tone that meant he was controlling something he felt strongly about. He paid Pete and left, and he was almost to his horse when he saw Eliza coming out of the dry goods store on the opposite corner, a wrapped parcel under one arm, and her head down against the wind. He would have crossed to speak to her, but before he reached the street he heard a voice behind him that made him stop. "Remarkable taste you've developed, Cross." He turned. It was Arthur Holt, Meredith's brother-in-law, a man who'd inherited a partial stake in the Holt Ranch and had been trying to expand it through social leverage ever since. He was standing with two other men Gideon recognized from the local Ranchers Association, both of them watching Eliza with an expression that Gideon didn't like. "Holt," he said. "We were just saying," Holt gestured vaguely at the other men, as if gathering witnesses. "We were just wondering what exactly the most successful rancher in the valley sees in a girl who patches other people's trousers for a living." He said it pleasantly, which made it worse. "No offense to the craft?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who moved quickly to anger, and he was especially not a man who could be provoked by someone who was trying to provoke him. But he was also a man who said what he meant. "I see character," he said, "which is rarer than you'd think." Holt's expression flickered. Not quite embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. "You know what they're saying in town. I know what some people are saying. It reflects on the ranch, Gideon, on your father's name." "Don't," Gideon said. His voice was quiet, but it had a quality that stopped the sentence cold. "Don't put my father's name in that sentence." Holt shut his mouth. The two men beside him were studying the middle distance with great interest. Gideon nodded once and walked across the street. Eliza had seen the exchange. He could tell from the set of her shoulders when he came up beside her. She was carrying herself carefully, like someone who'd learned to make herself small in moments of public attention. "I saw that," she said without preamble. "Don't worry about Holt." "I'm not worried about him." She shifted the parcel under her arm. "I'm worried about you. That's the third time this week someone said something in public about—" She stopped. "About the two of us, which is not even—" She stopped again, started over. "I don't want to cost you anything, Mr. Cross." "I'm aware of the costs," he said. "I don't think you are." She said it directly, not unkindly. "You've got a ranch that depends on your relationships in this community. Suppliers, hired hands, buyers for your cattle. If the people with influence here decide you've lost your judgment—" "Eliza." He used her first name without thinking about it, and she noticed. He could see it. Let me tell you something my father told me once when I was about 16 and making an argument for doing the practical thing instead of the right thing. He said, "There is no version of this where the practical thing and the right thing are actually different." I thought that was nonsense at the time. It took me 20 years to understand what he meant. She looked at him. The wind was picking at her hair, and she pushed it back with one hand, the parcel still under her arm, and there was something in her face that was open in a way it usually wasn't. Less guarded. "What did he mean?" she asked. "He meant that every time you choose the practical thing over the right one, you become a little more the kind of man who does that. And that man can't actually run a good ranch, because a good ranch requires judgment, and judgment requires knowing who you are." He paused. "I'm probably explaining it worse than he did." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He sounds like he was a good man." He was. They stood on the street in the wind for another moment, and then she said she had to get back, and he said he'd ride by later in the week, and they went their separate ways. He was aware of at least 4 people watching this exchange from various windows and doorways, and he didn't particularly care, which was itself a kind of answer to the question Arthur Holt had been asking. He rode home thinking about the name Blackridge and about his father's tone when he'd said it. The decision happened on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the first fence cut. He'd been turning it over since the horses. Walt hadn't said anything directly, but Walt had a way of being around when you were thinking that served as something between company and pressure. Cobb thought Gideon should bring in more hands and post a night watch. Sayers, who rarely spoke, said once that the sabotage was going to escalate, and that escalation meant whoever was doing it was expecting Gideon to fold. "They're testing patience," Sayers said, "running out yours and seeing what you do." He was right, which was annoying in the way that accurate observations often are. What Gideon did was saddle his horse on a Thursday morning and ride into Caldwell Flats and knock on the door of the narrow shop on Birch Street. Eliza opened it in her work apron, a pincushion on her wrist that she was clearly wearing without noticing it, and she looked at his face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing new," he said. "I need to ask you something." She stepped back and let him in. He didn't sit down. She waited. "The ranch isn't safe right now," he said. "I know that sounds like a reason to stay away from it, not toward it, and I understand if that's your thinking. But I need someone with a steady head, and I trust yours, and I think—" He stopped because he was making a mess of this. He started over. "There's a bedroom on the ground floor of the main house. It was my father's workroom. There's a bed in there that was put in when he was sick. I'm asking if you'd consider moving out to the ranch for a while." Eliza stared at him. "You're asking me to move on to your ranch?" "Yes, while there's active sabotage happening." "Yes." "Gideon." It was the first time she'd used his first name, and she didn't seem to notice either. "Do you understand what that would do to your reputation? Forget mine, yours. Every person in this valley would—" "I know what they'd say." "Then why?" He thought about how to answer honestly without making it sound like more than it was, or like something other than what it was. "Because you're competent, and you're steady, and something is happening on this land that I don't have the full shape of yet. And because I'm not going to let whoever is doing this decide what I do or who I associate with." A pause. "And because I think you'd be better off not alone on Birch Street right now." She heard that last part. He could see it land. "You think I'm at risk," she said. "I think you might be." "Yes." She turned away from him and looked at the workbench, the dress form in the corner, the walls of her small shop. Her whole life fit in here, and it wasn't a large life, but it was ordered and it was hers, and he could see her calculating what it would cost to leave it, even temporarily. "People will say I'm—" She stopped. "Yes," he said. "They will. And you're asking me anyway. I'm asking you anyway." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then she turned back. "I have orders. Work commitments. Mrs. Beaumont's daughter's wedding dress is half finished. Bring it." "I can't just bring a wedding dress to a cattle ranch." "Why not?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and made a sound that was almost a laugh but didn't quite get there. She was looking at him like she was trying to decide if he was practical or just stubborn and was having trouble telling the difference. "Give me 2 days," she said. "I'll send Cobb with a wagon Friday morning." She nodded. He left. Walking to his horse, he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for days. He didn't examine it too carefully. The news reached the ladies' auxiliary before Friday noon. Ruth Alderman, who had a gift for these things, found out through channels she never fully disclosed and passed it to Eleanor Graves, who passed it to Meredith Holt, who passed it to Arthur Holt, who was in Ferris's store by 3 o'clock that afternoon telling anyone who'd listen that Gideon Cross had lost his mind. By Saturday, the whole valley knew that Eliza Rowan had moved onto the Cross Ranch, and the temperature of the conversation in Caldwell Flats shifted from gossip to something harder-edged, the kind of talk that starts looking for a verdict. Gideon heard the report secondhand through Walt, who had sources of his own. 3 families had quietly indicated they might look elsewhere for their hay supply this year. Arthur Holt had told someone at the Ranchers Association that Gideon's judgment was compromised. Eleanor Graves had said nothing publicly, which was in some ways worse. Eleanor's silence meant she was waiting for something. He dealt with it the way he dealt with most things that weren't immediately actionable. He noted it, filed it, and went back to work. Eliza arrived Friday morning with Cobb and the wagon, bringing a trunk, a sewing basket the size of a small table, a half-finished wedding dress and a muslin cover, and a look on her face like she'd made a decision and was not going to second-guess it in public. She asked where she'd be working and whether the light was good in the afternoon in the east-facing windows. He showed her the room. She looked at the light, moved a chair, and said it would do. She was sewing by midday. She ate dinner with Gideon and Walt that first evening, which was awkward in the specific way that new arrangements are awkward. Nobody entirely sure of the shape of the thing yet, conversations starting and stopping without completing themselves. Walt was polite in the careful way of a man trying not to form opinions prematurely. Eliza was quieter than usual, more watchful. But at some point during the meal, she asked Walt how long he'd been at the ranch, and Walt told her. And she asked a follow-up question about the early days that showed she'd actually listened to the first answer, and something in the room shifted slightly and became less formal. After dinner, while Walt was outside and Gideon was washing the coffee cups, she said from the doorway, "I want to be useful." "You're working," he said. "On my own work. I mean useful to whatever's happening here. You know the shape of things better than I do, but I have eyes and I have sense, and I'm not going to sit in that room pretending nothing is going on outside." She said it without dramatics. "Tell me what you're watching for." He turned around and looked at her. She was serious and direct, and there was no performance in it. "I will," he said. Outside, in the dark beyond the barn, the valley was quiet. But somewhere in that quiet, something was still moving, still deciding what came next, still calculating how much pressure it would take to make Gideon Cross bend. It had misread the man. It had also, in bringing Eliza Rowan into the middle of this, made a mistake it didn't know about yet. Because Eliza Rowan had steady hands and a sharp eye and a habit of noticing things that other people walked past. And she was now inside the house, with the boxes and the trunks and the old stored things of Thomas Cross that nobody had looked through carefully since the funeral. She'd start going through them in the morning, looking for fabric suitable for a mending job. She'd find something else instead. She found it on a Tuesday, 6 days after she moved in. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular. The workroom she'd been given had a closet along the north wall that held, among other things, 2 boxes of Thomas Cross's personal effects that hadn't been fully sorted after his death. Things that weren't clothing, weren't tools, weren't clearly useful, the kind of accumulation a life produces that doesn't fit into obvious categories. Gideon had left them there with the intention of going through them someday, which meant he hadn't touched them. Eliza had asked if she could use the closet shelf space for her fabric, and Gideon had said yes, and so she'd pulled the boxes out to move them, and one of them had a broken bottom that gave way when she lifted it, scattering its contents across the floor. She'd crouched down to collect things. A folded letter in handwriting she didn't recognize, 2 small tools with wooden handles, a brass button, a strip of leather cord, and a leather case the size of a large book, latched and worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. She set everything in a pile and then paused with the leather case in her hands, because it had a quality she recognized, the weight of something that had been carried deliberately, not stored carelessly. Someone had put things in this case because those things mattered, and they had kept it close enough to develop the patina that came from handling. She set it on the workbench and opened it. Inside, folded with the careful precision of someone who had folded and refolded them many times, were papers. Survey documents, from the look of them, the thin kind with the official-looking margins, printed forms with handwritten figures filled in. And underneath those, a map, hand-drawn on linen, the kind of material chosen because it lasted, with ink lines marking boundaries and elevations and water features across a territory she recognized as the valley around Caldwell Flats. The detail was extraordinary. Whoever had drawn this had spent real time in the field, measuring and recording. She spread it flat on the workbench and looked at it. The boundary lines on this map did not match what she knew of the valley's current property divisions. She was not a surveyor and she was not a lawyer, but she had lived in Caldwell Flats long enough to have a working sense of who owned what. And the lines on this document described a different arrangement, a larger arrangement, with the Cross Ranch holding substantially more acreage than it currently claimed on its eastern and southern sides. The difference wasn't small. The difference was thousands of acres. In the margin of the map, in handwriting she was beginning to recognize as Thomas Cross's, were 3 words. Blackridge took this. She stood at the workbench for a long time, not moving. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in the south pasture checking on a calf that had been struggling since birth, and she walked out there in her work boots that weren't quite the right weight for the mud at this time of year, and found him crouched in the grass with his sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back, doing something with his hands she couldn't see clearly from a distance. Walt was nearby, leaning on the fence. "I need to show you something," she said when she got close enough. He looked up at her face. Whatever he saw there made him straighten immediately. "What?" "Inside. Bring Walt." She went back to the house. They came in a few minutes later, Gideon washing his hands at the pump by the door, both of them tracking mud she'd deal with later. She had the map spread on the kitchen table by then, and the survey documents arranged beside it in the order she'd found them. And she'd also found, tucked into the case's inner flap, a folded document with an official seal that she hadn't fully read yet. Gideon came to the table and looked at the map and went very still. "Where was this?" he said. "In a leather case in the box from your father's closet. The box broke when I moved it." She pointed to the boundary lines. "Is this what I think it is?" He leaned over the map, one hand flat on the table. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Walt came around the other side and stood there reading it with the focused expression of a man who had known this land for 30 years. "That's the Harlan Creek line," Walt said quietly, pointing to a water feature in the lower left of the map. "And that ridge marker. Your father showed me that marker once, years back when he was explaining the original grant. Said the actual boundary ran east of where the county map showed it." He straightened. "He said the records had been changed." "Changed by who?" Eliza asked. Walt looked at Gideon. Gideon was still looking at the map. "Blackridge," Gideon said. It came out flat and final, like something he'd been carrying as a suspicion for a long time and had just watched become a fact. He picked up the folded document with the official seal. He read it slowly, and she watched his face while he read it. The controlled stillness of a man working through something that made him angry in a deep structural way rather than an immediate one. "This is the original land grant," he said. "The one issued to my grandfather when the territory was open for settlement. It describes the full parcel." He set it down. "And these survey documents," he picked up the top sheet, looked at it, set it down. "These are the corrected surveys, the ones that went to the county office, with different numbers." "How different?" Eliza asked. 4,000 acres different. He said it without emphasis, which somehow made it worse. The Cross Ranch should be running from the Harlan Creek line to the South Ridge. Instead, the county map shows us ending a mile and a half short on both sides. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, wind was moving through the yard, and somewhere the barn door was doing its intermittent bang that Cobb had been meaning to fix. Walt said, "Thomas knew." "He knew," Gideon said. "Or he figured it out. He must have found these records somewhere, Sec. Or he had them all along and didn't know what they meant until he understood what Blackridge was doing." He sat down at the table, heavily, like the weight of the calculation was physical. "He never told me any of this." "Maybe he was trying to protect you," Eliza said. "Maybe." He rubbed the back of his neck. Or maybe he was still gathering proof, still trying to figure out who at the county office was involved. He looked at the map again. This has been going on since before I was born. My grandfather filed the original grant in good faith, and at some point after that, while my father was young, maybe, or maybe before he was born, someone in the Black Ridge organization got to the survey records and adjusted the lines. Is that possible? She asked. To alter official records. It happened, Walt said, with the certainty of a man who had lived through enough history to know what people were capable of. Money and time and the right connections. You can change what's written down. Most people don't know what the original said, so they don't know what to question. Eliza looked at the map and then at the sealed lining of the leather case, which she'd noticed but not yet fully examined. Something had prompted her to look at this case the way she looked at everything, with the attention to construction that came from years of working with fabric and leather and the materials that held things together. She picked it up. There's something else, she said. She worked the inner lining carefully with her thumbnail, finding the seam where it was stitched to the frame. Old stitching, done by hand, neat and deliberate. Not a standard construction. Someone had sewn something behind this lining. Gideon and Walt both watched her work. She didn't rush. She found the seam's weak point at the corner and coaxed the thread loose with a precision that came naturally, and then she reached into the space behind the lining and drew out a folded sheet. She unfolded it on the table. It was a list of names. 8 names, written in a hand she didn't recognize. More formal than Thomas Cross's writing, older ink, some of the letters formed in a style she associated with an earlier generation's schooling. Beside each name was a role: county assessor, district judge, land office clerk, and so on. At the bottom, one name was written larger than the others, underlined twice: Harlan Voss. Below it, Black Ridge Syndicate, principal. That's a judge's name at the top, Walt said. Retired now, Gideon said. His voice was very controlled. Retired 10 years ago, with a house in the capital and a reputation for integrity. He looked at the list. And those others, the assessor, I know that name. He died 4 years ago. The land office clerk. He stopped. He's still in the county office. Someone else knew too, Eliza said. This list wasn't written by your father. No, Gideon agreed. The handwriting is different. Someone else compiled this and gave it to him, or he found it, or... He shook his head slowly. I don't know. But whoever made this list was naming the people who made it possible, the infrastructure of it, the people who were paid or pressured or convinced to let the records be what Black Ridge needed them to be. The 3 of them stood around the kitchen table looking at a map and a land grant and a list of names, and outside the window the afternoon light was going flat and gray, the sky doing something complicated in the west. They know, Eliza said. Both men looked at her. Whoever has been cutting your fences and poisoning your well, she said, they know this exists. Maybe they knew Thomas had found it. Maybe they didn't know exactly where it was, but they knew it was here somewhere, and now that you've... She paused. Now that you've changed the pattern on the ranch, brought someone new in, started going through old belongings, they're scared it's going to surface. Gideon looked at her for a moment. That's right, he said, which means they're going to move faster. Yes. She looked at the documents on the table. We need to get these out of this house. Not yet, Gideon said. If we move them wrong and they find out, they'll know we have them. Right now they're not sure. We need to figure out who we can trust before we move anything. A lawyer, Eliza said, not in Caldwell Flats, someone from outside the county. He stood up and walked to the window. There's a man in Millhaven. Thomas used him for the water easement dispute 2 years ago. He's not connected to anyone here. How long to reach him? Ride would take 2 days. Letter would take 4 or 5. He looked out the window at the yard. I can't leave the ranch right now. Send Sayers, Walt said. Sayers can't... Gideon stopped. He can't explain what needs explaining. There was a pause. Then Eliza said, I can write the letter. Both men looked at her again. I can explain what these documents are and what they mean, she said. I'm not a lawyer, but I can describe what we found and where and what the discrepancies are. Give me the lawyer's name and his address, and I'll have a letter ready by morning. Gideon looked at her steadily. She met his eyes and didn't look away, and he was reminded of the day he'd walked into her shop and she'd been taking apart someone else's bad stitching with the focused certainty of a person who knew exactly what they were doing. She had that quality again now. "All right," he said. She sat down at the table with paper and ink while he and Walt put the original documents back in the leather case and secured it in a place they discussed quietly and agreed on without writing it down. She worked on the letter while they were doing this, and when they came back, she'd covered 2 pages in handwriting that was clear and ordered and precise, describing the contents of the case, the discrepancies between the original grant and the county survey map, and the list of names. She read it back to Gideon, and he caught 2 factual details she'd slightly mischaracterized, and she corrected them without defensiveness, and the final draft was as accurate as they could make it. Sayers rode out before dawn with the letter in his coat pocket, and instructions to go directly to Millhaven and not stop in any town he recognized. The next 36 hours were the strangest of Eliza's time on the ranch. The daily work continued. It had to. Cattle didn't stop needing attention because your paperwork had gotten complicated. And she kept sewing, and Gideon kept managing the herd, and Walt kept running the ranch's operations. But all of it had a quality of surface normalcy over something that was holding its breath underneath. They didn't talk about the documents at meals. They didn't talk about them at all. There was nothing to say yet, and saying things prematurely was just a way of wearing out your nerves. What broke the waiting was not news from Millhaven. It was fire. She woke at 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke and the sound of Walt shouting from the yard. She was dressed and out of the workroom in under a minute, and she pushed through the kitchen door into a night that was orange on the western side where the smaller of the 2 storage barns was burning, the fire already well established, the structure's dry timber going fast. Gideon was already there, working the pump line with Cobb and shouting for water. She ran back inside, not away from the fire, but to the workroom, to the closet, where the leather case was no longer stored but where a second set of documents was, copies she had made the previous afternoon, without telling Gideon she was doing it because she thought in redundancies the way her work had trained her to. Always keep a backup seam. She took the copy and wrapped it in the muslin cover she'd been using for the wedding dress and pushed it into the bottom of her fabric trunk under 4 bolts of cloth. Then she went back outside and helped. The storage barn was a total loss. They saved the main barn by sheer sustained effort and the fortunate direction of the wind, a group of them soaking the walls through the early hours of the morning while the smaller structure burned itself out. By the time the sky started going gray in the east, everyone was exhausted and smoke-smelling and covered in a combination of mud and ash that seemed to get into places you wouldn't expect. Gideon stood looking at the remains of the storage barn when the fire was out. His face was hard to read in the half-light. Walt came to stand beside him. "Anybody get a look?" Cobb thought he saw someone on the south fence line when it started, Gideon said. Gone by the time he could get there. "They're done being patient," Walt said. "Yes." He looked at the ruin. He looked like a man doing very specific cold arithmetic. "They know something's changed. They don't know what we found, but they know we're not backing down, and they know time isn't on their side anymore." He turned. "We need to talk to the neighboring ranchers." "Which ones?" "All of them," Gideon said. "Every family in this valley that Blackridge has been squeezing for the past 20 years. Because I'm willing to bet the Cross Ranch isn't the only property with boundary lines that don't match the original grants." He looked at Walt, and there was something in his expression that was tired but not defeated, the look of a man who had just changed the frame he was using to understand his situation. "This isn't just about us." Eliza stood a few feet away, still holding the shovel she'd used through the night, and she listened to this and felt something clarify in her own thinking. She looked at Gideon standing in the ash-gray morning, his father's hat on his head, the hat she'd rebuilt from a torn and abandoned thing, the hat that had turned out to be carrying something no one had looked for in 20 years. And she thought, everything that happens next comes from whether we can hold together long enough to use what we know. Her hands were blistered from the shovel handle, and her eyes were stinging from the smoke, and she was tired in a way that went past her body. But she was steady, and she knew it, and she thought that might matter in the days coming. Gideon started with the Pryor family. They were his nearest neighbors to the south, 3 generations on the same parcel. And old Marcus Pryor had known Thomas Cross well enough to serve as a pallbearer at his funeral. If anyone in the valley was going to listen without immediately calculating what there was to gain or lose, it was Marcus. Gideon rode out the morning after the fire, still smelling faintly of smoke, and found the old man mending a gate in the cold. Marcus looked at him, looked at the hat, looked at Gideon's face. "You better come inside, Tom," he said. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table, and Gideon laid it out plainly. What Eliza had found, what the documents showed, what the name Blackridge meant when you put it next to 30 years of land records and boundary disputes and families quietly selling off parcels they couldn't afford to defend. He didn't show the originals. He described them, which was safer. Marcus listened without interrupting. He was 71 years old and had the particular stillness of a man who had heard bad news before and knew the value of hearing it completely before he responded. When Gideon finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My eastern boundary line." "What about it?" "I've been in a dispute with the county assessor about it for 6 years. The recorded line puts me 40 rods short of where my grandfather's deed said the property ran." He looked at his hands on the table. "I paid a surveyor to come out in 91. He said the county records were accurate. I couldn't prove otherwise, so I dropped it." A pause. "I always felt something was wrong with it. Thomas felt the same about his south line. We talked about it once, years back, and both of us figured we were misremembering or that the original deeds were less precise than we thought." "They weren't misremembering," Gideon said. "No." Marcus looked up. "Who else are you talking to?" "You're first. I need to know who I can trust before I go wider." Marcus nodded slowly. "Talk to the Dunnigan brothers on the west side, and Petra Rask. Her husband fought with the county assessor's office for 2 years before he gave up. She knows what she lost." He paused. "There are others, 6, maybe 7 families who've had the same quiet argument with the same recorded lines and lost it every time." Gideon rode home with a clearer picture and a heavier feeling. The scale of it was larger than he'd let himself fully accept until now. This wasn't a local scheme carried out by opportunists. It was a deliberate, long-running extraction, systematic boundary manipulation across multiple properties, compounding over decades, with the county infrastructure necessary to make it stick. Harlan Voss had built something patient and thorough, and it had been working for a very long time. Sayers came back from Millhaven on the 4th day with a letter from the lawyer, a man named Aldous Crane, who had apparently read Eliza's description of the documents with considerable attention and written back in language that was careful and precise, and underneath its legal caution, distinctly alarmed. He wanted to come to the ranch. He wanted to see the originals. He wanted Gideon to touch nothing and move nothing and speak to no one at the county office under any circumstances. He could arrive within the week if travel cooperated. "Good," Gideon said, reading the letter at the kitchen table. Eliza read it after him. "He believes us. He believes the documents, which is the right thing to believe." She folded the letter and handed it back. "The copies I made are still in my trunk. The originals are where we put them?" "Yes." She nodded. She told him about the copies the morning after the fire, expecting him to be annoyed that she'd done it without telling him. He hadn't been. He'd looked at her for a moment and said, "Good thinking," and gone back to assessing the damage to the barn, and she'd found that response more settling than a longer one would have been. The next 4 days had the quality of a held breath drawn out past the point of comfort. Gideon met with the Dunnigan brothers and with Petra Rask, whose husband had died 2 years ago, leaving her to run a ranch that was smaller than it should have been, and with 2 other families Marcus had suggested. He was careful about how he described the evidence, enough to establish that he had it, not enough to let the details circulate before Crane arrived. What he heard from each of them was a variation on the same story. Boundary disputes that went nowhere, surveys that didn't match memory or older documents, assessors who were firm and official and uninterested in discrepancies that couldn't be proven, the slow acceptance of a loss that felt wrong but couldn't be fought without money and legal standing that none of them had. Petra Rask sat across from him in her kitchen and listened to everything he said, and then sat quietly for a moment looking at the table. "My husband died partly from the stress of it," she said finally. It wasn't an accusation of anything, just a fact she was stating. He spent 2 years fighting a boundary line and losing, And the ranch got smaller, and the debt got bigger, and his heart gave out at 54. She looked up. I don't want compensation, Gideon. I want them to have to answer for it. That's what I'm trying to arrange, he said. She held his eyes. Then I'm in. Blackridge moved before Crane arrived. It was Walt who saw them first. A group of riders coming up the North Road in the early afternoon, not hiding their approach, which was itself a statement. He counted 8 from the ridge and came back to the ranch at a trot. 8 riders, he told Gideon in the yard. I don't recognize all of them. But the man in front, I've seen him in town, works for the Blackridge organization, name's Decker. Gideon stood in the yard and thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, Get Cobb and Sayers. Tell Eliza to stay inside. He was at the gate when the riders came to a stop 20 yards out. Decker was 40-something, broad through the shoulders, with the unhurried manner of a man who was accustomed to his physical presence being sufficient argument. He had the other 7 ranged loosely behind him, not drawn but positioned. Mr. Cross, Decker said. Decker. I've been sent to discuss a business matter. You could have sent a letter. Decker looked around the yard with the particular expression of a man inventorying what he could damage. Mr. Voss would like to make an offer for the Cross Ranch. Full value, fair assessment, quick close. Given recent events, he gestured vaguely at the ruins of the storage barn, still visible beyond the main barn. It might be a good time to consider a fresh start elsewhere. Tell Mr. Voss I'm not selling. The offer is generous. I heard you. Decker looked at him steadily. There have been a lot of accidents on this property lately. There have, Gideon agreed. I've been keeping records of all of them. Dates, details, damage assessments. I've sent copies to a lawyer in Millhaven. He said it the same way he'd say anything else, not as a threat, just as information. Tell Mr. Voss that too. Something shifted in Decker's expression. Not fear exactly, but a recalculation. He sat on his horse and looked at Gideon Cross standing in front of his gate with his father's hat on and Walt and Cobb visible at the corners of the yard, and he apparently decided that the conversation had reached its useful limit. I'll pass that along, he said. They rode out. Gideon watched them go and kept his face neutral until they were beyond the tree line, and then he turned and saw Eliza standing on the porch. She hadn't stayed inside. He wasn't entirely surprised. You heard that, he said. Most of it. She came down the steps. They'll come back. Yes, and next time they won't come to talk. She looked at the road where the riders had gone. How long until Crane gets here? 2, 3 days. Then we need to be ready for 2 or 3 days. What followed was the most methodical 48 hours Eliza had spent since she'd learned her trade. Gideon sent word to Marcus Pryor and the Dunnigan brothers and Petra Rask. Not to come to the ranch yet, but to be reachable, to be watching their own properties, to expect that things might move quickly. Walt and Cobb and Sayers worked the perimeter of the property in shifts through the nights, and during the days they reinforced what they could and left certain paths and approaches looking unguarded when they weren't. Gideon knew this land the way you know something you've worked and walked for years, and he used that knowledge the way his father had taught him to use every asset available, so practically without waste. There were 2 approaches to the ranch that looked easy and weren't. There was a creek crossing on the south road that was passable in summer but treacherous after recent rain, and it had rained 4 days ago. There was a timber section on the east that looked like cover but was dense enough to slow riders to a walk. He walked Eliza through all of it on the second afternoon, not because she'd be fighting anything, but because he'd decided she needed to know the terrain as well as he did, and she listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, asking specific questions, remembering the answers, not pretending she wasn't frightened, but not letting the fright make her useless. If something happens, he said, when they were back near the house, the copies in your trunk and the originals together are stronger than either alone. Don't let them end up in the same place. I know, she said. I already moved the copies. He looked at her. Where? Mrs. Pryor's kitchen. I gave them to Marcus's wife yesterday when I rode over for supplies. She doesn't know exactly what they are. She thinks they're patterns I'm leaving there for safekeeping because of the fire risk. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me. I'm telling you now. She met his eyes. You had 8 men at your gate, and you were managing 4 things at once. It needed to be done, and I could do it. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not quite surprise, but a version of recognition, the kind that comes from seeing something confirmed rather than discovered. All right, eat, he said. They came at night, as expected. Eliza heard it first, not riders this time, but something lower and closer, the sound of the main barn doors being forced at the hinge. She was awake, which she had been most nights since the fire, and she was out of the workroom and in the hallway with the leather case under her arm before she'd consciously made the decision to move. She could hear shouting from the yard, Cobb's voice, and then Walt's, and then a sound she felt more than heard, the specific percussion of something structural giving way, which turned out to be the small equipment shed on the west side going down, deliberately pushed, not burned, a distraction. She understood that immediately, and understood also that the distraction was meant to pull attention toward the west while something happened in the east. She went east. The ranch house's east side had a door that opened onto the kitchen garden, rarely used, and she pushed through it and stopped. 2 men she didn't recognize were moving toward the house from the tree line, carrying something. Not torches, something else, a box or a case. And they were moving quietly and purposefully, and hadn't seen her yet. She had about 4 seconds. She didn't run. Running would tell them where she was going, and they were faster than her in open ground. Instead, she stepped back inside, locked the kitchen garden door, which bought her almost nothing, but almost nothing was something, and went to the kitchen table where Gideon had left a shotgun that afternoon with the clear implication that she should use it if she needed to. She didn't like guns. She knew how they worked. Everyone on the frontier learned at some point, but she'd never had occasion to use one in anger, and her hands were not entirely steady when she picked it up. She heard them at the kitchen garden door. She heard the lock fail, which took about 8 seconds, better quality than she'd given it credit for. She backed to the far wall of the kitchen and held the shotgun at a height and angle that she was almost certain communicated clearly what she was prepared to do. The door opened. The man who came through it saw her and stopped. He was bigger than she was, and he had a blade at his belt, and he was looking at the shotgun with the assessment of someone working out whether she'd use it. "The documents aren't here," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "They've already been moved. You came here for nothing." The man looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the room. At the trunk in the corner, at the shelves, at the general layout of a space with nothing hidden about it. He was thinking, she could see it, recalculating. "Where are they?" he said. "Not here," she said again. "That's all I'll tell you." Outside, the sounds of the yard had changed. She could hear more voices now, and then Gideon's voice specifically, which she located with a speed that she noted without examining. There were more people in the yard than just the ranch hands. She heard Marcus Pryor's voice. She heard someone she thought was one of the Dunnigan brothers. The man in her kitchen heard it too. He made a decision, which was to leave, and she kept the shotgun where it was until the kitchen garden door was closed again, and she could hear him moving away through the garden. She put the shotgun down on the table and leaned against the wall and breathed for a moment. Her hands were shaking now, which was apparently what they'd decided to do once the immediate situation was resolved. Outside, the voices were getting louder and then organizing into something that sounded less like a fight and more like a confrontation, the kind where one side had more people than the other side had expected. Gideon had apparently made the same calculation she had about the timing, because he'd gotten word to Marcus and the others, and they'd come. Not armed for battle, armed for witness. 7 families from the valley, standing in the yard of the Cross Ranch at 2 a.m, watching Decker's men discover that burning a barn and frightening a woman and destroying evidence was a different proposition when there were 40 people watching you do it. She came out onto the porch. The yard was lit by lanterns somebody had brought, and in that uneven light she could see Gideon standing near the gate, and she could see Decker on his horse with his jaw set and his men ranged around him, and she could see Marcus Pryor and Petra Rask and the Dunnigan brothers, and 4 other families she recognized, standing in a loose mass that was not quite blocking the exit, but was very clearly watching. Gideon was talking to Decker in a low, even voice. She couldn't hear everything. She heard, "You've been seen by 40 people on this property tonight. You've been seen conducting an unlawful entry. My lawyer arrives tomorrow." Decker said something she didn't catch. "Tell Voss," Gideon said, clear enough to carry this time, clear enough that everyone in the yard could hear it, that his survey records are being reviewed by independent counsel. Tell him the original land grants are accounted for. Tell him the names are accounted for. He let that sit for a moment. Tell him to get a lawyer of his own. Decker sat on his horse in the lantern light with 40 pairs of eyes on him, and he had nothing to say to that, and after a moment he turned his horse and his men followed him out. The yard was quiet. Then Marcus Pryor said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'd say that went about as well as it could." And somewhere in the cluster of families somebody laughed, a short, released sound that broke the tension the way a pin breaks a blister. A small relief that was really a very large one. Eliza stood on the porch of the Cross Ranch in the cold early morning with her arms wrapped around herself and watched the families of the valley standing in the yard, their lanterns making irregular pools of yellow light, their breath coming in small clouds, all of them still present and still holding. She was shaking a little, and she was tired in a way that went to the bone, and across the yard Gideon Cross caught her eye and held it for a moment with an expression she didn't try to translate into language. The leather case was under her arm. She hadn't put it down since she'd picked it up in the workroom, and she wasn't going to put it down until Aldous Crane arrived and took custody of what it held. One more day. Aldous Crane arrived the following afternoon in a rented buggy with a leather satchel that looked like it had traveled more miles than most men twice his age. He was 50-something, thin, with the particular kind of precision in his movements that came from spending decades in rooms where details mattered. He shook Gideon's hand, nodded at Walt, and looked at Eliza with an expression that shifted slightly when Gideon explained she was the one who had written the letter and found the documents. "You wrote that letter?" Crane said. "Yes," Eliza said. "It was the clearest description of evidentiary material I've received in 30 years of practice." He said it plainly, not as flattery. "Shall we sit down?" They spread everything on the kitchen table, as the original land grant, the survey documents, the map, the list of names. Crane worked through them methodically, touching each piece with the careful handling of someone who understood what he was looking at and why it mattered. He asked questions. He made notes. He occasionally asked Eliza to clarify something from her letter, and she answered without hedging, correcting herself once when she realized she'd overstated a measurement. After 2 hours, Crane sat back and looked at Gideon. "This is actionable," he said. "The original grant is clear. The survey discrepancies are documented in the Black Ridge Organization's own filings, which means we can demonstrate both the fact of the manipulation and the mechanism. The list of names is—" He paused. "The list of names is extraordinary. If we can corroborate even half of them, we have a conspiracy case that goes well beyond a property dispute." "How long?" Gideon asked. "To file? A week? To reach a hearing? Months, potentially. Courts move at their own pace." Crane looked at the documents on the table. "But I want to be honest with you about something. Filing this will create immediate pressure on Voss and on anyone connected to Black Ridge. Some of those people have resources, and they will spend them trying to suppress or discredit this evidence. The original documents need to leave this property today." "I have copies at a neighbor's property," Eliza said. Crane looked at her. "Good. The originals come with me. The copies stay distributed, and I'll need statements from the families you mentioned. Anyone who can document their own boundary disputes and losses." He looked at Gideon. "Can you get me in front of those families?" "Tomorrow morning," Gideon said. "I'll send word tonight." Crane stayed at the ranch that night, which was its own kind of statement. A lawyer from Mill Haven, sleeping in the Cross Ranch guest room with the original documents in his satchel, was the kind of fact that would reach certain ears quickly. Gideon wasn't sure if that was good or bad, and decided it was probably both, and that by this point there wasn't much to lose from being visible. The meeting the next morning happened in Marcus Pryor's barn, which was larger than Gideon's surviving one and had the advantage of belonging to a family that had been wronged independently of the Cross situation. 7 families came, the same ones who had stood in the yard 2 nights before, plus 2 more who had heard through Marcus that something real was finally happening and wanted in. Crane was good at this, Eliza noticed. He didn't perform. He sat on an overturned crate with his notebook and explained what the document showed in language that was plain enough for anyone to follow, and then he asked questions and listened to the answers. And when people got angry, and they did, because hearing confirmed what you'd suspected for 20 years was its own kind of blow, he let them be angry without trying to redirect it prematurely. Petra Rask said, "My husband spent 2 years of his life fighting this. He went to the county office 6 times. He was told 6 times that the records were accurate and that he was mistaken about his own property lines." "I believe you," Crane said. "And we can show why he was told that and who benefited from him being told that." Petra looked at him steadily. "And what happens to those people?" "That depends on what we can prove and who is still alive to be held accountable. I won't promise you a specific outcome, but I can promise you that what I file will name names and cite evidence and go into the public record, and once it's there, it can't be taken back." She nodded once. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was the look of a person accepting the limited but real thing being offered, rather than holding out for the complete thing that wasn't available. They gave Crane their statements over the course of the morning. Eliza wrote 4 of them, at the request of families who felt their spoken account was clearer than their written one, sitting at a table in the corner of the barn with paper on a board, asking questions and recording answers in the clear hand that Crane had already told her was better than most legal clerks he'd worked with. She didn't mention that. She just wrote. It took 3 months. That was the part that nobody who'd stood in the yard in the lantern light had fully reckoned with. Not the danger which had felt real and immediate, but the grinding procedural work that came after. Filings and responses, and counterfilings and requests for documentation and challenges to evidence, and a Blackridge lawyer from the Capitol who arrived in Caldwell Flats in November looking expensive and confident and spent 2 weeks attempting to establish that the original land grant documents were forgeries. That effort collapsed when Crane produced a chain of custody that traced the leather case from Thomas Cross's personal effects through the inventory taken at his death, witnessed and signed by Walt, who had been present at the inventory and whose memory for dates and details proved to be remarkably durable under questioning. The lawyer from the Capitol had not expected Walt. Most people didn't, which was one of Walt's advantages. Harlan Voss himself appeared in Caldwell Flats only once during this period, in December, arriving in a well-appointed coach and holding a brief and reportedly uncomfortable meeting with his local representatives at the hotel. He was 73 years old and had spent 40 years building something he believed was permanent, and he sat in that hotel room and learned that it wasn't. Eliza didn't see him. She heard about it from Ruth Alderman, who had sources everywhere and had apparently decided sometime around the night of the lanterns that Eliza Rowan was someone worth being on good terms with. The county land office clerk named in the documents, the only one still active, resigned in November before formal charges were filed. The retired judge issued a statement through his lawyer that was widely understood to be the statement of a man trying to minimize consequences. 2 of the other names on the list were dead. 3 cooperated with Crane's investigation in exchange for considerations that Crane described only as arrangements, which Eliza understood to mean that the justice available was imperfect and partial and was going to have to be enough, because it was what there was. She'd spent enough time with imperfect things to know you could work with them if you were honest about what they were. The formal ruling came in February, on a day with low gray sky and the specific cold that settles into a valley and sits there. Crane rode out to the ranch to deliver the news in person, which Eliza thought well of him for. They sat at the kitchen table, Gideon, Eliza, Walt, Crane, and Crane read from the document with the measured pace of a man who understood that the words had weight and deserved to land properly. The Blackridge Syndicate's claim to the disputed territories was voided. The Cross Ranch boundary was restored to the original grant description, adding 4,300 acres along the eastern and southern lines. The Pryor family recovered their 40-rod discrepancy. Petra Rask's ranch was restored to the acreage her husband had spent 2 years trying to reclaim. 5 other families received similar restorations, ranging from small parcels to substantial ones. Harlan Voss's holdings in the territory were frozen pending ongoing proceedings in the Capitol, where Crane had forwarded the full case file to prosecutors who were considerably more interested in it than Crane had initially promised they would be. That part was not guaranteed to resolve the way anyone hoped, and Crane said so plainly. Voss has money and lawyers, and he's had 40 years to make himself difficult to reach, Crane said. I won't tell you he's going to prison. I don't know that. What I can tell you is that his operation in this valley is finished, and the record of what it was is permanent." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have settled for that." "Would you?" Crane asked. Gideon thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "I'd have wanted more, but wanting more than what's available is just a way of refusing what is." He looked at the ruling document. "So yes, I'll settle for it." Walt said nothing, but his eyes were wet in the way of someone who had held something for a long time, and was now, carefully and without wanting to make a production of it, setting it down. The town took longer to settle than the court did. Caldwell Flats had spent several months in the uncomfortable position of watching a situation it had mostly dismissed as a poor seamstress and a rancher making bad decisions turn into something that rearranged the foundational property map of the valley. The gossip shifted registers multiple times, and Eliza was aware of it without tracking it closely, because she had work to do, and the gossip was going to do what it was going to do regardless. Mrs. Beaumont's daughter had gotten married in December with a dress that was, by all accounts, the finest piece of tailoring seen in the territory that year. Eliza had finished it 3 weeks late, under circumstances that Mrs. Beaumont had decided by November to consider romantic rather than inconvenient. This was the first adjustment. The story of the seamstress and the rancher and the lost hat and the hidden map becoming something the town could be proud of having been near, rather than something it was embarrassed to have dismissed. Ruth Alderman was instrumental in this revision, not because she was dishonest about the history, but because she was honest about it in a particular way, which was to say, yes, people had been wrong, and here is why they were wrong, and here is what they should think now. This was a skill Eliza had not previously appreciated in Ruth, and she made a point of appreciating it now. Eleanor Graves came to see Eliza in March. She came to the ranch, so Eliza was still there, had been there through the winter, and had begun to understand that the question of when she was going back to Birch Street had quietly shifted into a different question that neither she nor Gideon had addressed directly yet. Eleanor arrived in the morning on a working day, not a social one, and found Eliza at the kitchen table with the wedding dress commission that had finally come in from a family in the next county. "May I sit down?" Eleanor said. "Please," Eliza said. Eleanor sat. She looked at the fabric on the table, the pins, the careful chalk marks. She looked at Eliza's hands. Then she looked at Eliza's face. "I was unkind," Eleanor said. Not unkind about the specific things she'd said or done, but unkind as a summary statement, which Eliza thought was actually the more honest form. "You were protecting what you thought was reasonable," Eliza said. "That's generous of you." "It's accurate." Eliza set down her pen. "You weren't wrong that the situation looked impractical. You were wrong about what mattered, but that's a different thing." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People keep saying that," Eliza said. "I'm never sure if it's a compliment." Eleanor made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. "It is," she said, "though I understand why you'd wonder." They had coffee. They talked about the valley's changed property situation and what it meant for water rights, which was Eleanor's area of practical concern, and Eliza knew enough by now to follow that conversation reasonably well. When Eleanor left, she shook Eliza's hand at the door with the directness of a woman who meant the gesture. It wasn't a full repair. Some things that have been said in a certain way don't go back to before, but it was a beginning of the kind of thing that becomes normal over time, which was worth something. Gideon put the hat above the fireplace on a Saturday in late March. Eliza was in the main room when he did it, not watching intentionally. She was sitting in the chair near the window with a mending order, and he came in from outside with the hat in his hands, which was unusual because he wore it every day. He stood at the fireplace for a moment and then reached up and set the hat on the 2 small iron hooks that had been above the mantel since his father had put them there, holding nothing, waiting. She watched him do it. He stood with his back to her for a moment after, looking at the hat on its hooks. Then he turned around. "He put those hooks there when I was about 10, he said. "I asked him what they were for. He said he didn't know yet." He looked at the hat. "I think he knew." Eliza looked at the hat above the fireplace. The The rebuilt brim, the new leather band, the old felt that she'd matched so carefully you had to know where to look to find the repair. She'd spent 3 weeks on that hat in the back of her shop on Birch Street, in the spare hours between orders, for a man she didn't know, because it had seemed like the right thing to do with something that deserved better than to be left broken. She still didn't know entirely how to account for what that had started. She was not a woman who spent much time trying to trace the lines of cause, from small acts to large consequences. She was too practically minded for that kind of reflection, and too aware that most of those lines were invisible until long after the fact. But she was aware that a hat sat above a fireplace in a house that was beginning to feel like hers, and that the valley outside the window was more justly divided than it had been 6 months ago, and that Petra Rask's ranch was the size it should have been all along, and that Walt had cried in the kitchen in February in a way he'd tried very hard to make private, and that all of this had something to do with the decision to do a careful thing for its own sake and ask nothing back. She thought about what Gideon had said his father told him, that there was no version where the practical thing and the right thing were actually different. She'd been turning that over for months. She thought she understood it better now than when she'd first heard it, which was probably how understanding worked. You had to carry a thing for a while before its weight made sense to you. "It looks right there," she said. Gideon looked at the hat and then at her. "Yes," he said. "It does." They weren't easy people, either of them. Gideon was stubborn in the specific way of men who had been wrong for long enough that they'd learned to be very careful about their certainties, which made him slow to commit and difficult to read. Eliza had spent years being overlooked, and had built a self-sufficiency around that experience that sometimes read as distance. They disagreed about things, about how to handle the remaining legal proceedings, about what to plant in the south field when spring came, about whether the kitchen needed a new stove, which was a conversation that went on for 3 weeks without resolution. None of that was a problem. Problems were things that needed to be fixed. This was just two people with histories and edges, working out how to occupy the same space without smoothing themselves flat to manage it. The ranch came back slowly, the way things that have been genuinely damaged come back. Not all at once, not without setback, but steadily. The storage barn was rebuilt in April with lumber that Marcus Pryor helped source and the Dunnigan brothers helped cut, and Cobb and Sayers spent 3 weeks putting together. The east and south boundary extensions meant new fence lines, which was months of work and represented the single largest project the ranch had taken on in a generation. Walt managed it with the organizational instincts of a man who had been running things quietly for 30 years, and was now doing it slightly more visibly. Eliza's shop on Birch Street was still there. She kept it. She went in 2 days a week to handle orders and check on the space, and the remaining 3 days she worked at the ranch, at the table in the workroom, or increasingly at the kitchen table when the light was better. Her work had picked up in a way that she found slightly bewildering at first. Commissions from families who hadn't previously needed a seamstress on Birch Street. Invitations to work on projects she'd have considered out of her range 6 months ago. She didn't flatter herself that this was purely about her skill, because she knew enough about how people operated to understand that some of it was social adjustment, being associated with the person who'd found the documents, or being seen as someone worth being seen with now that the story had resolved in a particular way. She worked as well as she always had. That was what she could control. She was in town one afternoon in April when she passed Arthur Holt on the main street. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, with the particular discomfort of a man who had been publicly wrong, "Miss Rowan." "Mr. Holt," she said. He nodded and kept walking. That was all it was. She didn't need it to be more. The valley by late spring was different in ways both visible and invisible. The property lines had changed, and people knew it, and there was a quality in the conversations at Ferris's store and in the Ranchers Association meetings that was altered. Not warm, exactly, but less like a negotiation happening over something hidden. Some things that had operated on silence needed the silence to operate, and once the silence was broken, they couldn't quite rebuild themselves. Harlan Voss never came back to the territory. His proceedings in the capital were ongoing and grinding, and Crane sent periodic updates that were cautious but not discouraging. Whether it ever fully resolved, whether the accounting was ever fully made, was something none of them could know yet, That was the honest version of justice in a situation like this one. Partial, slow, impermanent, better than nothing, and less than what was owed. You could either accept the gap between those things, or you could exhaust yourself in it, and Eliza had never seen exhaustion produce anything better than acceptance eventually did. On a warm evening in May, she was sitting on the porch of the Cross Ranch watching the light go off the ridge when Gideon came out and sat in the other chair. They sat in the way of people who'd gotten past the early self-consciousness of being near each other and had arrived at something quieter and more durable. After a while he said, "I never asked you why you fixed the hat." She thought about it. "I found it broken," she said, "and it seemed like it hadn't always been broken. Those are usually the things worth fixing." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know who it belonged to." "I knew it had belonged to someone who wore it every day for 30 years. She watched the light on the ridge. That was enough. He didn't say anything to that. She didn't need him to. The hat sat above the fireplace inside, on the hooks Thomas Cross had put there 30 years ago for a purpose he said he didn't know yet. The valley outside was returning to what it had always been before someone decided to quietly take pieces of it. Not perfect, never perfect, but more honest than it had been. The families on their restored acreage were doing the work that needed doing in spring, which was the same work it always was, planting and mending and building and trying to be ready for whatever came next. You couldn't know what came next. That was one of the things the frontier taught. If you were paying attention, the future was not something you secured. It was something you prepared for with the best judgment and the steadiest hands you had. Eliza knew that. She'd known it since she was young and had nothing except her skill and her willingness to work carefully on things other people had given up on. It turned out that was enough to start with. It turned out it always had been.